Hey everyone, how's it going? I come to you for the final week of Sagalong. So we've come to it at last. We have come to the end of Egil's saga. And like with Nial's saga last year, Egil's saga kind of ended with a whimper rather than a bang. And I think that kind of ending is common in sagas, and I think the reason that it, from our modern perspective, I think the reason that it seems to end with a whimper rather than a bang is because these aren't novels, right? These aren't novels as we think of them. We want to read them like novels because they're stories written in prose and so on and so forth, and they also have dialogue sometimes and some novelistic elements, but really what these are, I think, are like one part epic poem, one part kind of folk/history, and another part novel. And the reason I say folk history rather than like mytho history in terms of these sagas is because they don't involve like gods and goddesses and this sort of thing. They involve sort of more folk-like elements like the werewolves, shapeshifters and such. So that's why I say folk history, but sort of mytho history/folk history. And so that's how I think of the sagas. And so they don't end. They don't tend to end on a climax necessarily. Always, some of them do, but they seem not to always, and frequently not to. And I think that's because they are chronicles more than anything. They just end when they run out of material, basically. And that did not work as well with Nial's saga for me. Nial's saga for me was was great reading experience. I loved it, but the ending was, I didn't love it. But the ending of Egil's saga, I think it was handled much better. So in this final quarter, there aren't a ton of huge events. There's one more kind of dramatic incident, which I'm not going to dwell on too much. I could draw some parallels between it and other events in the saga, but I don't think I'm going to focus on that. I just want to focus on kind of Egil's final years. So in this final quarter of the saga, he moves back to Iceland and just settles down and basically lives a quiet life in his old age. Kind of a retirement in a way. And we see him get old. We see him start to get frail, actually. There's even a striking scene where he falls, where he's walking somewhere and he falls, and some people make fun of him for it. And so you've seen this great warrior kind of decline into this man who's having trouble walking. He also loses his eyesight, which I think is interesting because in a lot of mythical stories, when someone, at least in Greek mythology, when someone loses their eyesight, it tends to be a sign of a fall, like when Oedipus gouges out his own eyes, right? But in Norse conceptions, loss of eyesight seems to be more associated with wisdom, because like Odin, the god Odin, gave up, I think, one of his eyes for wisdom, I believe. And Egil loses his eyesight in his old age. And in his old age, it seems that he also becomes wiser than he was when he was younger. It's kind of interesting just how much of a contrast the older Egil is to the younger Egil, because the younger Egil was so impetuous and violent and dislikable. And now in his old age, he's almost become an arbiter of justice in a way, because there's a scene where he actually does sort of mediate between his son and another man who are having a dispute, and he mediates the dispute and solves it. And so he does become this kind of judge, and that's a very different... He kind of becomes this judge who is making peace, which is very different from what he is early in the saga, where he's very much a war maker, I guess. And so his blindness seems to be associated actually with wisdom. But there's also a profound sense of melancholy in this last quarter of the saga. A lot of the sagas have a very melancholic overtone, but this last part of the saga seemed particularly sad, just because, I mean, there's a scene where we're told that two of Egil's sons have died, one of whom was like one of his favorite sons. And there's basically this scene where he and one of his daughters, who he's very close with, basically they both say that they don't want to live anymore, that they want to starve themselves to death because they are sad about his son dying. And so this is very emo section, and then he writes this long poem just lamenting the loss of his sons. And it's a very touching poem. I think a lot of it is lost in translation. It is touching to read in English, but I imagine that it is a work of much greater power in the original Icelandic, and so it's unfortunate that I have to read it in English translation, because even though I found it touching, I did, it was sort of a rather mechanical translation. But yeah, so there's this sense of melancholy, both in terms of his decline and in terms of, these losses happening, because I believe Bjorn, his friend, dies as well. And then the saga ends on a very striking image. So the saga, spoiler alert, ends with Egil's death. And not too long after his death, Icelanders begin to adopt Christianity. And so the final image of the saga is in a Christian cemetery, I believe, where a priest looks at Egil's skull, which apparently is being kept in a church. And so I thought I would just read you the passage, because I think it's kind of interesting. So here it is. Skafti Thorarinsson, the priest, a wise man, was there at the time. He picked up Egil's skull and put it on the wall of the churchyard. The skull was astonishingly large and even more incredible for its weight. It was all ridged on the outside like a scallop shell. Curious to test its thickness, Skafti took a fair-sized hand axe in one hand and struck the skull with it as hard as he could, to try to break it. A white mark was left where he struck the skull, but it neither dented nor cracked. This goes to prove that such a skull would not have been easy for weak men to damage when it was covered with hair and skin. Egil's bones were buried by the edge of the churchyard at Mosfell. And what I think is interesting about that final image is that it emphasizes the strength of Egil's skull, right? My guess is that the subsequent generations after Egil would be described as not as big or powerful as him, right? That tends to be the case, I find, in things like the Icelandic sagas and Greek mythology. You find that the younger generation is always slightly inferior to the older generation, and then if there's a third generation, they're even more inferior. Not exactly inferior, but less, like, supernaturally robust, Egil is described as being like a giant, and obviously here his skull is described as being really thick and hard, supernaturally so, almost. And I get the sense that if we were to see a description of the generations after him, they would be described in less impressive terms. But what I noted in that final passage is that even though the skull is so strong and it's emphasizing its strength, it's still a skull. He's still just as dead as anyone else who was not as big and powerful as him, right? And so that was a very kind of sobering note to end on in Egil's saga. And so anyway, I thought that was a really cool way to end it. I thought very interesting. It actually reminded me a little bit of like Hamlet, right? Hamlet with the skull in the graveyard. I have no idea whether Shakespeare would have been aware of the sagas, but I like drawing those parallels just because, whether they're spurious or not, I like talking about them. But I definitely thought of Hamlet when I saw the interaction with the skull, kind of. But I was surprised by Egil's saga, I have to say. And I probably shouldn't be surprised by now, especially in light of what I said at the beginning of the video, that sagas don't follow the kind of novelistic conventions that we've come to expect, that they're working on their own logic. But I was surprised, I have to say, that there wasn't more of a real climax to the story. It really was just a chronicle of this man's life from birth to death, literally. Actually, from before his birth, right? Because there's a whole prologue piece of the saga that could be its own separate short story. That all takes place before Egil is born. So we see a prologue beginning of his life. We see him go through his life, and then his life ends. And that's the story. That's all it is. And so it tells the story of his life as it was really lived, rather than telling it according to the conventions of novels that we expect, right? Because we just saw him go from one activity to the next, from one adventure to the next, and on and on and on. And along the way, he, loved and lost, so to speak. He killed and was almost killed, and so on. And then we see him sort of just retire and fall into old age, which is what happens to a lot of people. And at the end of the day, I think it's really powerful that Egil Saga is told that way, that it's told in the way that a human life really happens, rather than with novelistic conventions kind of imposed on it. As I'm saying this, I'm reminded of Virginia Woolf's novel, The Waves, which obviously has very little actual relation to the sagas, but it's another work of literature that tries to tell the story of people's lives as they're actually lived, not as they would be described according to a plot for a novel, because life doesn't actually align with the events of a novel. And that's an interesting connection, obviously, because obviously in so many other ways, Virginia Woolf is completely unlike the sagas. But anyway, I thought it was a really powerful work, and I think it's my favorite saga now. And that's saying a lot, because Njal Saga, despite my reservations about its ending, is one of my favorite works of literature. The Saga of Gunnlaug Serpenttongue is also one of my favorite works of literature. So the fact that Egil Saga sort of took that place is impressive, I think. But anyway, so this will be a shorter discussion, certainly, than last week, but that's probably for the best. But if you were reading along, please let me know what you ended up thinking of the saga as a whole. Did you like the way it ended? Did you like kind of the way that it told Egil's life? And I would also be curious to hear what you all thought of the poetry, because the poetry for me was a mixed bag. Unfortunately, I wanted to love the poetry more. I could see in the poetry a lot of interesting imagery and turns of phrases. They just weren't rendered very artfully into English, I don't think. And so, again, I imagine that in Icelandic, it's beautiful. Like, especially that long poem that Egil composes on the death of his son. I imagine that's so powerful. But in English translation, it's touching, but not really remarkable, unfortunately. So I'd be curious to hear what you all made of the poetry, especially if you're not reading it in English. I think there are some people not reading it in English. So anyway, just let me know what you think of the poetry as well. But yeah, I will leave it at that. I keep my own discussion, my own commentary to a minimum, and ask the audience what they think. But anyway, I will shut this off. It's been a great Sagalong. So glad that we were able to do it again. And so in terms of Sagalong, I will see you all next year. And you can get a look at Bessie here. Hopefully you see that. I don't know what you're seeing because the camera. I can't see the camera. But anyway, hopefully you've got a view of Bessie. And anyway, I will turn the camera off now.